Hello, welcome to Saltgrass, and today we are live in the studio again with Zoe Scoglio, and this is the last of our 4 episodes together where we have been sharing stories that Zoe has collected from around town about people who are finding ways for community to gather, care, share, support each other in all sorts of different ways. And we've explored quite a few of them over the last few weeks with Zoe. And today we've got 2 more examples of that. And we also have a guest live in the studio with us, which is exciting. Alison Nye from the Country Women's Association, or the CWA. And we've got a pre-recorded interview that Zoe did with Kaz.
I chatted to Kaz, also known as Carolyn Neilson, about her home, Murnong, which is a plot of land that's subdivided with a number of properties living there, and they have a body corporate model. And I thought it was a really interesting model, thinking about community in terms of those you live with, but they also think about community in terms of how the people living on the plot of land can also share their resources and their ways of thinking about interdependence with the broader community in Castlemaine. So we had a great chat out on the property a few months back, where great. Kaz gave me a tour of the property and a rundown of some of the logistics and some of the desires and thinking and behind the creation of their home.
People consciously living together in separate houses on the same land. Cool, great. So before we begin any of that, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Jara country, which is the home of the Dja Dja Wurrung people who have lived here for tens of thousands of years, taking care of the land and each other in all sorts of beautiful ways. And we would like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and that we live on stolen land and that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
Salt of the earth. Salt. Grassroots. Salt of the earth people. Grassroots change. Saltgrass.
Listen to all episodes of Saltgrass on your podcast app or at saltgrasspodcast.com. You are listening to Saltgrass, and today, Zoe, as the last of our Castlemaine Commons themed episodes, we've got Kaz, or Carolyn Neilson, from Murnong, and that's our first set of interviews. So let's talk a bit about that. You just explained that the idea behind this chat was that to look at how people who choose to live intentionally on the land and with each other can share a property, and how I'm assuming in the interview you look at sometimes how that's difficult and how that works. So
yeah, I won't give too much away because it's all embedded within the audio file, but having Alison here as well is exciting from the Country Women's Association, because both of the people, I chatted to Alison as well during lockdowns, but the phone line was a terrible connection, so unfortunately those interviews didn't get recorded well enough, but it's great to have her here in person today in the studio. And I'm interested later on, after hearing this recording, to talk about some of the different forms of organising, grassroots organising that go on, and the hard work behind that in terms of how do you deal with the interpersonal relationships, but also different levels of governance that can make things happen and be able to lobby and be able to make changes in line with one's values and the needs on the ground. And all of this, just to recap for anyone who's joining in and hasn't listened to the previous sessions together, I mean, all of this questioning around collective care and community organising locally was very much in response to the pandemic and thinking about crisis and increasing precarity that's going on in the world environmentally and socially and economically, and the understanding that we need each other and the different forms of community that exist locally to be able to learn from each other and build upon what's already existing.
Yeah. Beautiful. So think about those things as we hear your interview with Kaz from Murnong.
We wanted to be a community in community, so we were very purposefully not wanting to, or the intention was not to be self-sufficient, so we wanted to be able to integrate in the community so that we had transactional, not just transactional, but connections to community, but it was also supporting the community, so not self-sufficient and and not self-sufficient, and not isolated. We bought 2 titles, so it was 10 acres in total, but 2 titles. 1 title with that house down below, and then we got the planning permit to do the subdivision into 4 titles, and the bothy that's a common asset if you want, and then. Yeah, so we got the planning permit to do that, and then we had to put the services onto the blocks, onto the titles. So that was where we were just in the early stages, just engaging with tradies to say how much is this going to cost and how do you do it. And another thing we really all decided on was we wanted to share infrastructure as much as possible. So that's where the solar panels came along. And then we realised that hadn't been done in Australia. And we thought, well, if we set that precedent, it then means that, say, for example, some elderly residents up at Kawika who arguably within their own little house or unit don't have great solar exposure, they could then, if they can share solar panels, they can put the panels anywhere and have one inverter. And then what you just do is you measure your electricity consumption and you work out the electricity bills that way. You kind of reconcile stuff. So we, it took us a wee while to advocate for it. It was a bit of a battle, but because we had to. It was really exciting actually, because Steve Brahini, I don't know if you know him, he's an electrician in town who was one of the earliest electricians who was totally in favour of solar, hot water, solar panels and everything. And he came and did the electricity for us here at Murnong. He was great. And he actually ended up, with us lobbying, he ended up going to meet Penny Wong in Canberra to lobby for this as a kind of system. So it was good. So we set a bit of a precedent there. So I think it took us over a year to lobby for it. So it reduced costs and it set a precedent. So people that just don't have great solar exposure, you could share a system. They could put it on the neighbour's house and have one inverter. You could set up legal systems to really battle to get services on then. They just wear you down the process. So
I guess that's the benefit of having
thank you, love.
A group of people.
Yes,
so that you can take that on one person by themselves. Oh
yeah, definitely.
Amazing. That looks really touching. Yeah, some soy milk, I think.
Thanks, love. Sorry, we've the little kids that live here down the bothy, they ate all the biscuits this morning, so little munchkins. They're gorgeous though. When other people have said, I want to do a community, we said, look, it's a shitload of work. No, we don't want to put people off, but we want to be really realistic about the amount of work, what you really need to know. And you don't do it I wouldn't do it as one couple. It's a lot of work. So we had 3 families. Each family had little kind of portfolios that we researched while we were developing the concept and then finding land and then building it. Yeah. And I think that's a really good thing. There's no way, I don't know, Dean, we wouldn't have done this by ourselves. You want people to know you can do this.
Yeah.
But yeah, we share all the infrastructure. So we share the rainwater tanks and the dam water tanks that are up there. And then they're the header tanks. And then there's tanks down below that we pump up to there. And we share the solar, which sits on a common shed that we use, a sort of work shed. We share veggie gardens and orchards. We share electricity, water. We share woodlot. We share
all the orchards here.
Yeah, orchards. We share the chooks. So there's not really much apart from individual lots. So we're not like a cooperative. Well, one of my little portfolios at the beginning was researching all the different legal structures of the different intentional communities in Australia and even further. But and finding out why they went with particular structures, and then the group eventually decided on this body corporate one because they felt, like you're saying, it was a sort of what they felt was a reasonable balance between the challenges of sharing stuff but not an added challenge of sharing a common purse and having an individual lot where you could get in and out pretty quickly. Like Healesville and other communities where it's a cooperative, people sometimes can't leave for a while because it's all around a common decision-making process, which can get quite, understandably, quite fraught maybe, or, because there's it's a consensus decision around who comes in instead of them, and it gets really. Whereas this is you just sell on the open market. So what we've got with the body corporate, when you get your subdivision and you sign on, if you want, like as a body corporate in the subdivision law or act, you've got to have rules that it's like your compendium or whatever that guide how you live and guide how you live in that legal structure. And there are standard rules, but most of the time the community, and they're kind of fairly standard rules, but most communities want their own special rules, that you call them. So we've got a compendium. We call it the Old Testament now because it's pretty outdated, but rules around how you live together. And most of it's guidelines. They said, look, keep the rules to an absolute minimum and have more guidelines and have a really strong, robust consensus decision-making process and a really robust conflict resolution process. Conversation, rather than saying you cannot do this and you can't do that and having this huge rule book, you're kind of empowering people to have good, honest conversations about how do we do this. The compendium, those special rules sit with the title, if you want, in the subdivision. So there's that conscious thing that when you sign off on the title, you're actually saying, I abide by these rules and guidelines. Yeah. So our process is, if somebody wants to sell, they come to the body corporate first and say, hey, we're going to sell, and we get the rest of the body corporate get first option. If there's any families that are interested, they're meant to meet us, come to, say, a working bee, come to meetings, so they begin to sort of understand whatever culture we think we're about or the philosophy of the place.
There you go. That was Carolyn Neilson having a chat with Zoe as you walked around Murnong. And I love those incidental moments where, like, she's commenting on the kids having eaten all the biscuits and
the problems of collective living.
Yeah. And I think any committee of management ever who's had a biscuit tin have had moments of, who ate all the biscuits? Where are all the biscuits? I thought that was really interesting in terms of what she was reflecting on, how in-depth they went in terms of thinking about what the best structure was to facilitate them to live as peacefully as possible. Because I think that often people come together with the best of intentions, but unless you have some rules in place or guidelines, really make it conscious what everyone's expectations are of sharing that space, you can come to a lot of grief because we don't even know what we're expecting until we're in the thick of it and go, but didn't you want to do that too? And then you realise you didn't.
Yeah, having the exit strategy sort of embedded within that, but also that thing of learning from, mistakes and things that have worked previously.
In other places.
There's so many lessons to be learnt and gathered to help those processes along. Yeah.
So we have Alison here from the CWA, or the Country Women's Association, and I am sure that an organisation that has survived over a century in Australia has had some very robust discussions about governance and how to go forward and how to conduct yourselves. Maybe let's start with a little bit of history about the CWA, Alison. Can you tell us how it all started and why maybe it was formed?
I can't tell you so much about the overseas, but I can tell you that the local one in Castlemaine started as a main need during the war for the women to have a purpose to help each other, and for those who don't have the men around them to be able to get the proper support and work together with others, with the community, and especially those having babies, because it was a hard yard being on your own with a baby in those days. And
so was that World War One?
Yeah, probably it came in a little bit into World War Two. Yeah. Between the two, there was a period. And also to do with the land.
And the Great Depression.
People with the land, all of those things linked together. Yeah. And so it started here, and one of the Lavini ladies was one of the ones. From the original ladies.
From the Buddha homestead. Yeah. Which is a famous historical homestead here in Castlemaine. Yeah.
So she was one of the early founders.
Great. But you were saying earlier off air that perhaps the concept had started in Canada even.
I think it originally started in Canada before the turn of the century. Yeah. There was obviously needs over there, and then went across to Britain, as far as I know, and Britain, Scotland, UK, I should say, and then it made its way out to Australia.
Very interesting. I think it's such... I hadn't really realised... I think coming to Castlemaine, having grown up in the city... I came here about 10 years ago, and there's, the idea is that it's all about scones and jam and cream and maybe some knitting.
Well, it is.
But underlying that is a really solid foundation of support for community, isn't it?
Yes, and they work together to lobby governments for changes for women. It's mainly there for women and children, women and their children, and predominantly it would have been a lot more on the land because they had less people helping them, so they
More
used to
isolated.
get together much more isolated and in difficulty, tiny towns and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So our purpose here would have probably been quite different to Britain's and the Canada's originally.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so when you say the land, you mean in helping look after their property and the sort of needs?
And how to
of
survive and how to work with each other to go forward and survive.
Yeah. Yeah, that really stood out when we chatted and you talked about that and just the difference of a regional context where there is such a distance.
Yeah, well, you could imagine people it was all horse and cart and walking and a bike. So you can imagine people stranded even as far as Malden here trying to get together to do something. It was a lot harder.
20 Ks by bike or walking or
Horse and cart.
horse and cart is
tough.
a really long way. Yeah.
Very tough. So all the little towns used to have their own little groups and came together, and some of the women travelled and helped each other.
Amazing. And so that's in the context, obviously, of the Great Depression and war and... they were very tough times, weren't they?
They were very tough times. That was where the land army became prominent too, because the women had to do all the work on the land, farm, for survival,
and keep the food
keep
flowing.
the city people going.
Yeah, that's right.
So I guess that's a huge learning curve going on as well, perhaps, or just a huge increase in work.
No, well, some of them were already doing it. I was brought up on the land, and I didn't know there was any other life. I just thought everybody did it. Yeah, and I was driving a tractor at 8 and all that sort of thing. Well, they still do it. It's the rules and regulations have changed, but what you're expected to do or what you're brought up with is on the land hasn't changed at all.
Yeah. And in terms of the rules and regulations within the organisation, how has the organisation changed over time to cater for the changing needs of the community, do you think?
I don't really think there's any less need for the assistance for women and their children than there was in those times, except they're different now. They might be... you might have more homelessness, visible homelessness, family violence. You might have... some of the women who are trying to climb the ladder have still got the same problems. They're not accepted. That's still there. That hasn't changed. And they're working hard, really hard in agriculture. They're working hard to get labelling changed. There's a huge, big agricultural section of the CWA that works with different countries of the world. And they get together every so often and work out what to do or try to help. And, and then there's in the medical profession... just about everything you think of. We're not just hardly any of them actually stay at home and do scones and jam and cream.
Yeah.
But there are a lot who do, and it's because the general public love it.
Yeah.
And that's one of the best fundraisers there are.
It's a great way to fundraise. But that's really interesting that there's so much advocacy and trying to change or push against how things have been done conventionally, which is similar to what we heard Kaz talk about in terms of them going, well, why don't we be the first ones? Why don't we do that? Why don't we set the precedent for people sharing solar power across multiple households? And they did it. And I think that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, they have scholarships. The CWA runs scholarships for different programs, educational, nursing, agriculture. There's, I think, 6. I can't think of the others at the moment.
And is
Each year.
Is there international sort of collegiate feeling?
It's called, there's a thing called Australian Women of the World. What is it? I think it's called Women of the World, and each country helps other countries to, like they work on this where they're getting women in third world countries to have clean water, the girls to be educated, that sort of thing. That's going on all the time, and that's done out of London. So you have Australia, and then they go over and represent, and they have other countries come in, and they have that every second year, I think.
like a big conference and
They
a
do.
gathering. Yeah.
Yeah, but they communicate all the time.
I bet they eat more than just scones and jam and cream.
Yeah, it's massive. That's some of them don't even get jam and cream in their interval.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting to hear how diverse the activities at the CWA is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's probably much more than you think. It's very deep. I'm only just here in a little place in a little branch, and we just do our own thing. They also ask you to recognise what's needed in your own community and work towards that. And then if you want to be involved, you just go into the next level, and you do go into that. You can actually climb right up.
Yeah.
You can actually do really well.
Yeah.
And there, when you get right up there, you're communicating with the politicians and the prime ministers and
Yeah.
others, so you can make change.
And so what have you seen being needed in our region, and how many other women are involved at this very hyper-local level in our town?
Well, we've got five branches in the Shire.
Just in Mount Alexander Shire alone?
Correct.
5 branches, great.
And some of them aren't very many, but sometimes it's better not to have too many because you're all familiar with too many in a group. So over the COVID, it'd be the isolation and the lack of communication, and people who feeling desperate, like what to do, how to get over this, I'm not going to be able to make it, that sort of thing, was very prominent. And then when we had the property, being able to have somewhere to live became really prominent as well.
So the housing crisis,
The housing crisis and the family violence numbers went up as well. So
Through the pandemic,
so that was what I was witnessing in our region.
Yeah, great. Yeah, very tough times for a lot of people. And I think it was interesting to see that consciousness of how family violence is increasing through the pandemic, because stress levels and financial distress and financial insecurity and all of those things, and people being stuck in a house together and not being able to leave.
That was what it was. It was the fact that you weren't able to go and see somebody.
Yeah.
You might be interested to know that in family violence, the male often allows the woman or go to CWA only. That's the only thing he'll let her go to because he sees that as safe.
Yeah.
So he doesn't have to control that.
Yeah, well, whereas he'll control every other social interaction she has. That's really interesting. I'm in the studio with Zoe Scoglio and Alison Nye from the CWA. Zoe, what have we got coming up next?
So we're returning to my conversation with Carolyn Neilson. I'm at Murnong in Castlemaine, where Kaz is continuing to share with me about how her home, the sort of body corporate set up on the property where she lives, was established, and some of the needs that informed the decisions around living in such a way.
The personal needs, like the individual human needs rather than...
human needs.
Yeah.
And the desires and the ethics and values that underpin it as well.
Because it was so interesting with the first clip that you played of hers, how much they had to think about the governance and the structure and all that sort of stuff. And that, of course, it exists to support the human beings who have to interact with each other. And... Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting in terms of the theme of this series around thinking about care and interdependence now, understanding our responsibility not just to look after ourselves, but to be able to look after each other. So anyway, these themes you'll hear being played out in the particular context of Kaz's life.
All right, great. Let's hear it.
Right, we'll go for a wander. Do you want an icy Paul?
Oh, I'm good.
Yeah?
Yeah.
You sure?
Thanks.
Do you want a beer?
I'm good. The tea, the taste of the tea is still.
Yeah. Okay, all right.
It was a very nice cup of tea. Thanks for that.
That's all right. I'll let
Perfect cup of tea
you
time,
handle
too.
this thing. So back in 2001, there was 3 families really keen on building some sort of community. So we did a bit of research. We started looking for land around here in Castlemaine. We had, I think, some really good, big conversations about fears, concerns, needs, passions. How do we do this? We really went with that idea of not too many rules, but lots of guidelines. So we really took on that, or felt, that seemed a good idea to us, that if we build capacity as a group of people and build healthy enough relationships, you shouldn't need lots of rules. We'll be able to figure it out. So the need was creating, nurturing, I don't know, whatever, a community. And however we define community is an interesting one. Affordable housing. And the need to raise our children in a more collective way. But I don't think we had an intention that was literally as intentional as it was more. Yes, we're recognising we're on common land, so the kids will inevitably kind of be raised by all of us in a way. But it wasn't like we have the same rules for all the kids or anything like that. But yes, I think the needs were affordable housing, definitely, because we realised, I mean, that was a long time ago, but even then prices were rising around housing and land. And a collective way of living together in reducing your footprint. So it was a sort of, looking after country kind of thing. When we got the titles and were ready to invite people on board, I reckon we had about 20 families interested. And generally, the women, they're all hetero couples. The women were really keen and the men not so keen. Generally, I mean, I'm generalising heaps here, but I was just fascinated at the gendered kind of perspective. The men didn't like the clustered housing situation. They would have been more interested if it had been further apart. They really wanted their space when we were sharing so much infrastructure, whereas the women really liked that. Because none of us had biological family in the Shire.
Interesting.
So, and I think that was part of it. It was, how do we do this, creating family or it's a different type of family. You know, I'm always interested in Castlemaine where people just, but with an intention to do something similar, pull down fences amongst houses. And so they're, I'm intrigued by that, and I wonder, they're in the definition of community, where, some people say community is actually where you're relating to people you wouldn't necessarily choose to relate to. That's real community. Where there's neighbourhoods in town that they just pull the fences down and just done stuff together, and you think, I think that's awesome. I think during the pandemic we decided to meet once a week, I think, just to check in. It was more, I think we just called it a check-in, just to see how people were going and what we could do to support each other, but also support the broader community.
That was Carolyn Neilson, or Kaz, talking about her experience of setting up and running Murnong, which is a group of houses. And I thought that was really interesting, and it really echoes some of the points that we've been talking about with Alison here, especially about, I really appreciated that point she made about the women's desire to gather closer together and support each other in the raising of the families and the whatever other needs they might have, and how that wasn't necessarily reflected amongst the men in the group. I just thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, it is interesting to notice the different gendered sort of stereotypes and norms, but also that thing of raising children, like traditionally being the women's domain, and how much that requires
a village.
A village has a lot more care that is needed, and time and energy, and a village, exactly. Yeah. So these sort of like basic needs, I think, also really determining ways in which people build relationships and friendships or extended family to be able to feel supported and support each other. And I also love Kaz's mention around how do we define community, and I think that's a really important question to keep coming back to, in terms of the fact that community is not this monocultural thing, but in fact it's very much about how do we engage with difference and with people who might have very different lived experiences and worldviews, and to be able to find ways of caring and connecting and building relations with those that have very different ways of being in the world.
Absolutely. I find it really interesting because the word community is thrown around all over the place, obviously. Like, you can have a community of like-minded folk, or a community that are together simply situationally because they live on the same street. But when I lived in Melbourne, for example, all of my communities were very similar age, very similar interests. And we would all go to, I was in the art scene, so we'd all go to exhibitions together and go out to parties together. And while I was in my 20s, that was my community. I didn't have to interact with my 80-year-old neighbour 3 houses down, or, I wasn't involved in local council. I wasn't involved in all sorts of levels. And when I moved out to Castlemaine, I really noticed that the community was naturally, in a small town, much more diverse. And people with similar interests were all age ranges. You wouldn't just be with your 20-something mates who had the same interest. You'd be with people of all age ranges who had that same interest. And in lots of ways, that diversity feels so much healthier in a lot of ways. But what she was saying was sometimes that's when you are relating to someone you wouldn't normally interact with. And I found that a really interesting point too. And I think that maybe that's a good link back to the Country Women's Association. Alison, what would be your reflection on what makes community?
Yeah, respect for each other, respect for what they are. They're, never mind how old or young they are, or whether they're upright or not. You just have to work out how to deal with that. And some of them want privacy, just make sure you do that, but keep an eye. So you just try and build on what you have and then enlarge on that, and after a while some of that changes and becomes closer to you as well. Yeah, so in other words, don't just look after your neighbours, look after just a bit further down, and just keep half an eye on what's going on a bit further, because it will affect you some way. So you may as well, embrace it and do what you can. But you don't have to, go and put your nose in there all the time or interfere or make too many scones. You just, you can sit back from that and think, okay, well, how can we help? Or should we ring up, or should we just, get their mail for them, or what should we do to help the older or the disabled? Yeah, and make sure they get out and meet people and stop this social isolation that is here quite apparently, actually.
I was wondering as well, in terms of dealing with difference, how does the CWA in its governance structure, or I can imagine it's different for every group as well because there's so much diversity in that front, but how the group, or from your experience, have managed difference, and also in terms of there being younger generations coming on board and the difference in sort of perspectives or experiences of people of different generations.
It's very welcoming, and they do sometimes have a project each year, and some of the projects are, let's work with kindergartens this year, and there's other projects that might be teenagers. There's they have a medical thing they look after, so they learn about that, and so if you want to enlarge on that, or any branch wants to enlarge on that, they're welcome to. But it's more becoming aware, making people aware, and then is there something we can do to make that better?
And I guess society is ever changing, and I'm sure the Country Women's Association has had to change with it in terms of accepting different people. And this is not a question I ran by you before we came on air, but has the Country Women's Association had to grapple with, there's ever emerging ideas about what womanhood is, and the trans community are becoming more apparent and vocal and representing. Has the Country Women's Association had to think about defining what a woman is? And
they do all the time. I'm sure they do every day. Yeah. And in they've had to deal with a lot of it, and in amongst them are some of those people, so they've got to learn how to work with those people and to take that forward, and to accept their needs, and what can we do to make it better for everybody else. Yeah, so they'll be dealing with it every day.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's really fundamentally your core values are how do we make sure people...
Women and children.
Women and children are taken care of, and it's... As long as you stick to those core values, I think you can come through. It doesn't
matter what you like. It doesn't matter whether you got 3 years or... It's just, if you need help, you need help. That's it. What can we do?
Yeah. And so can any woman approach the CWA and say hi?
Any female... Well, actually, we can actually have men come to meetings and events. We're not a closed door. but they can't vote. Under the Incorporation Act, how it's set up, it's women only are members only, so members get certain rights, and the men. But I've often been to events where the men are there as well. They're there for other reasons, like heavy lifting, driving someone home, and minding the children, whatever needs to be done. So we embrace people. We love people.
Yeah.
It's not, but often the women's interests are a little bit different to some of the men, so they usually sit out the car in the car, go for a drive, while the women do their talk about their other things they're doing this week, this month.
Yeah,
I noticed, I'm just curious, I had a question, but I'm also curious what the differences are. Like, what do the women like to talk about?
Different branches have different things. Like one area might just do theatre. There's a lot of people who do theatre. Some people do books. They do a lot of book club. Some will do agriculture. There's some who are out there to change what's going on overseas for the betterment of women. Some are in it just for the cooking. Some are in it, and our branch at the moment is enlarging on keeping items out of landfill. So we're working with the local op shop to the things they don't sell, we get given and we make items. And we just got a grant from the Shire, yes, thank you, for a U-Butte sewing machine, so we can do some more sewing for that. And what we're trying to do with that is if we can send some to the Indigenous community, because they've got nothing, we've got things we're throwing in the tip, they've got nothing, they've got rags. So we're just looking for, if there's anybody knows anyone who goes regularly to Alice Springs, we've got things we can send them.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, so that's the sort of thing our branch is doing. Another one might work more on, they might even do agricultural, but they might be doing gardens, community gardens, or there's just different things. People go into schools and work with the children when they're allowed.
And I guess it depends who else is active in the community working on that level. So we've got Community House who've got a community garden and they do community lunch. So you guys don't need to do that because they're doing it.
That's right. Well, we can still join in and enlarge it and take it further. But so you look at your needs in the community and try and work out what your branch should be good at or what you enjoy the most. And at the moment we're into hands-on sewing, crochet, making things. So if anyone wants to have any experience or needs how to know how to mend something, we're here. We're on.
Great, they're good skills to have.
Yeah, well they are, passing on skills. That's what we're good at. We're good at thrift and we're good at passing on skills.
Yeah, great.
You mentioned as well previously around being quite a big lobby group in Australia, or one of the biggest
women's lobby group left in Australia.
Yeah, wow. Are you? But that's another thing I found an interesting parallel in terms of what Kaz was talking about and the Country Women's Association. Are those? What are those governance structures? How does it work in terms of lobbying government or for different policies?
You start at your branch level, you go to your group level, and then you go through to the main conference and put resolutions up, similar to a lot of groups do that same format, and from there then they get representation to the parliamentarians and put what they voted for, what we've asked for.
So really coming up from the grassroots of people addressing needs on the ground and
well, sometimes you have to go. It has to be a government resolution. Sometimes it's only within your own area. Just depends on what your needs are, what you're trying to change, what you're trying to get better.
Yeah. What are some examples of things that the Country Women's Association have successfully advocated for?
Seatbelts in cars, helmets for bikes. This is only what I can remember. Labelling on food products throughout the world. They're into sustainability heavily. Homelessness, there's dealing with homelessness. Social isolation, medical, things to do with medical issues. That's very high up.
They're really significant changes that have been done obviously for the safety and well-being of everyone. But it's amazing that it took the Country Women's Association to really push that through.
Yeah. Oh, and I didn't say about sometimes the women's issues in general, they're very strong on pushing for women's issues, of course. Yeah.
It's interesting as well, Kaz mentioned briefly around the check-in that they were doing during COVID in the community there at Murnong, the sort of, checking in on your neighbours, which I'm sure lots of people around the world were doing in these times. You don't have to be part of a particular organisation to do that. People can just do that at any point. However, it does seem that maybe certain pre-existing communities and organisations in some instances are better positioned to be able to respond to these crises and support each other, and especially around housing and basic needs around food and shelter and safety. And I was curious just to hear from you as well around some of the things that the Country Women's Association were doing in that time.
Just keeping in touch with each other and trying to see that people were surviving and able to be mentally alert. If they needed appointments, somebody should be able to help them. I, for instance, looked after we've got a young mum, single mum with us. She had a hernia removed during COVID. I looked after her little girl. Her 3-year-old. It was wonderful. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's it brought you being part of the Country Women's Association?
It's just a matter of that I can help the community and hopefully get changes where they need to be, just like that, and to pass on skills.
Yeah. And to hang out with beautiful 3-year-olds.
Hang out with, be surrogate grandmothers like we all are.
Yeah. Do you feel like being involved how long have you been involved with the Country Women's Association?
Since I was 18.
Wow.
I was a single parent myself and at 18, and I used to go with my mum. She couldn't drive, so I used to take her.
Wow. And was she
In New
involved
South Wales.
before that?
No, she wasn't, because she couldn't get anywhere. She was isolated. She couldn't drive. She was one of those women that they needed to help.
Yeah.
Back in New South Wales on land, so we were,
Very interesting. So you actually really understood what a difference it could make for women to have support and
from an early age, actually, from an early age.
Yeah.
And so New South is probably has a slightly different emphasis than Victoria, I have noticed, but at the end of the day, it's really a matter of what's happening in your town or your area, and that's what grows. But to be able to pass on our skills and to work with youth and to see a betterment for women is still there.
Mm. And obviously you still see it as being vital in our community.
As much as ever.
Yeah. What do you see the future of the organisation being?
It'll probably struggle a little because a lot of the people are older. We need to work harder to work in with youth and get them involved and get them into joining the committees and things, so they can then take it further, be a little bit more politically involved, I guess. They'll all, if you come across a child when they're young and you teach them something, I never forget it, and that's something that doesn't go away. So that's the sort of thing. We shouldn't do it, everybody should do it, but we're very good at it.
Yeah. And I guess as governments come and go, either Liberal or Labor or, left or right, we see services being whittled down or enhanced. And I think in Australia we are very lucky. We have got a lot of governmental support compared to other places for medical needs and we've got Centrelink to support people who can't work for whatever reason, but it's obviously not really enough for people to live well, and a lot of people talk about this, but at least we have a very bare minimum. But I think organisations like the Country Women's Association is so vital because you're always there, no matter the ebbs and flows of those different governmental kind of like supports for society. You're always there underneath, just saying we've still got you. Yeah,
they're still there. They're still there. They're still raising funds. They're still trying to get a betterment every day.
Yeah. Which is interesting because I guess it formed before a lot of those social security services were in place.
There wasn't
as well.
anything for the women.
So I think, and as it's sort of collapsing and being further eroded, and so many people that fall through the gaps as well, it's this, the importance of learning from those who have lived experience of gathering together to support. I had a great chat as well with Wilson Bunton as part of this project, who's part of the Pioneers and Old Residents of Castlemaine Association. And he was also mentioning just on his own life of, using for his first home a housing co-op and different sort of friendly societies, and how these co-ops were created to be able to provide housing based on people's income and means, and that sort of direct alignment. And now the housing crisis is absolutely insane, and just the fact that so many people are really struggling to make ends meet. And there's, I think, a lot to be learnt from intergenerationally.
There's a whole different ball game now than when. I mean, I slept in my car. I know what it's like to be homeless. So it's different now, though, based on basically what you can earn and where you can live. It's the gap's closing, but a lot of people now sadly won't live together as much as they did when I was on my own. I just had to put up with living in one room in one small flat, sharing, to be able to take myself up to the next level. But that we've somehow or other that's been broken down. And
so share housing.
Any format. If people did a lot more of that here, we would have half the problem we would have here.
Which is why I guess Kaz's example is so great as well. Like learning about models that exist of like we need to live together and find ways to live together to be able to make things possible.
But we're going apart from that. I'm not quite sure what that is in this area. There's a lot of single households where a single person's in a household.
Yeah, I guess a lot of it coming down to legislation as well, and zoning, and how the regulations are also playing out.
Yeah, and culturally people just have expectations, I guess. We are running out of time, I'm really aware, but I did want to point out that there are housing groups that are looking at how people can share land and things like that. So Anitra Neilson, I know, is involved with that. There are definitely people talking about those things, but how much it's possible is another, or how much people are really prepared to share. And I think that's where having good governance really makes or breaks people's ability to share spaces like that. Anyway, I think we need to wrap up. We're coming up to 5 o'clock, and
thanks so much, Alison.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming in.
That's okay.
And thanks, Kaz, for chatting to Zoe on another day.
Thanks, Kaz, and thanks, Ali, for having me on Saltgrass and Castlemaine Commons as part of this. It's been a real treat to share stories with you and chat.
Salt of the earth. Salt. Grassroots. Salt of the earth people. Grassroots change. Saltgrass.
Listen to all episodes of Saltgrass on your podcast app or at saltgrasspodcast.com.